J.J. Dewey here again. We've been talking about the principle of majority will and presenting a plan whereby people will gather together and select a congressman that is committed to follow the majority will. And when the majority makes their will known to the congressman, he will be committed to vote according to the actual will of the people who elected him. Now, there are quite a few avenues or areas where the people are at odds with the government. In other words, the majority of the people, what they want is often different than what the government wants or what the government does or where the government spends our money. And so we're going to present something kind of interesting that traces its idea back to an interesting time in history. We go back to Halloween Day, October 31st, 1517. Can you think back to your history books as to what makes this an important time in history? An event happened that changed the world. The man was Martin Luther. Not Martin Luther King, but Martin Luther, the founder of the Lutheran Church, the guy that started the religious Reformation at that time. He was fed up with the church at that time because the church was at odds with the people, the scriptures, and Martin Luther's idea of what was the will of God. And a lot of people were frustrated at the church at that time because the thing that really irritated them more than anything was what was called indulgences. The rich people were able to buy an indulgence. And what this entitled them to, it entitled them to be able to enter into heaven if they paid the religious leaders a big chunk of money. So this worked out pretty good for the rich. They could just go commit all the nasty little sins they wanted, and then they could pay their priest a certain amount of money, and they were guaranteed to go into heaven after they died. Now, this kind of aggravated the poor people because they could not afford an indulgence. So, you know, even though they hadn't committed that many sins, it looked like they were going to probably go to hell because they didn't have enough money to buy an indulgence, and not very many people felt their conscience was quite clear enough to enter into heaven. So these indulgences was one thing that really irritated the people at that time. It really irritated Martin Luther. This was just one thing out of many. But today we have indulgences too. In the political world, there are people with a lot of money. They can go to Congress and they can buy what they want and they can live the heavenly life because our tax money begins to flow into their hands because they bought their way into the seats of power. And so we have indulgences today similar to what Martin Luther faced in his day. This got Martin Luther thinking. Now, he had to be careful because back in those days, if you offended the powers that be, you wound up getting burned at the stake, boiled in oil, tortured. All kinds of nasty things could happen to you. But Martin Luther took a calculated gamble in the fact that by stressing these indulgences, he had the people on his side. And so if they wound up doing something to him, you know, he calculated that the idea that perhaps the people would rebel. And he was correct because he got away with it. And so he calculated that he would stress these indulgences, but he would write up 95 theses, 95 points where the people, the scriptures, and God were opposed to the religious leaders of his time. And so he wrote these up, and he put them on the internet. What? Was the internet back in 1517? Actually, they did. They had the internet at that time was a church. It was called the Castle Church. And if you had something you wanted everybody to see, you went and posted them on the door of the Castle Church. And all kinds of people went and read what was posted there. And so Martin Luther wrote these 95 Theses, and he put them on the door of the Castle Church. And all kinds of people came and started reading them, and by word of mouth, it really began to circulate, and people began to talk about it so much, he then published it as a pamphlet and circulated it far and wide, and lo and behold, the Reformation began, and the whole religious world began to change from that point on. He eventually created a domino effect that led to many things that are in our Constitution and laws that we have today, all started because of the 95 Theses created by Martin Luther. So what I've decided to do is write a new 95 Theses. And this 95 Theses is for the people today, and the powers that be aren't the religious leaders. A lot of people complain about religion, but they're complaining a lot more now about Congress than they are religious leaders. As I said last week, a recent CBS poll showed that Congress has an approval rate of 15%. Boy, I bet the church in Martin Luther's day had an approval rating higher than that. I bet if you went and did a poll in Martin Luther's day, and ask them, even though rich people can buy their way into heaven, do you approve of the way the priest is handling things? And I bet it would have been about 30% approval rating back then. But now we're down as low as 15%. One time I read it was a couple years ago down to 13%, but it's up around 15% right now. And several polls give it different amounts. Another one gives it around 20 or so. But CBS is a pretty good poll. They give it 15%. Not that great. And so it's the people against the government. And so I'm listing 95 theses, or 95 points, where the people need action from the government to put them in harmony with the will of the people, similar to what Martin Luther did with the religious leaders of his day. So hopefully when we publish far and wide these 95 theses, it'll have a similar effect that people can catch on with the idea, or to the idea, that they can actually create change, that change is possible. And this is the most difficult thing for people, is they think, well, you can't fight City Hall. You can't make change, same old, same old. They have all these catchphrases they keep uttering, and then they just complain. Well, complaining doesn't do it. We have to do more than complain. We have to present an actual plan and then implement the plan. Without a plan, nothing happens. And that's why nothing has happened. There's been no decent plan to make anything happen. Okay, I'm going to read and comment briefly on these 95 theses, and then after we cover these, we'll go into more detail, certain points where the majority of the people are not represented and how to correct them. Now, these 95 theses are not written in stone, because as time passes, we'll find that some of these will grow less important, and then other points will become more important, and so maybe like thesis 80 will be switched over to something new, and because that won't be so important. So this will be like a changing document as time goes on, because the government seems to have this native ability to come up with things that aggravate the majority of the people. I mean, they come up with new ways to do it all the time. So when they come up with an ingenious, creative new way to aggravate the majority of the people, well, maybe we can just slide that in as one of the theses and take out one of the less important ones. So this will be a kind of a living document, so to speak. Thesis number 1. We, the people, demand the government listen to our voice. Now, each one of these points, I believe, will reverberate in the hearts of the majority of the people. And don't you think the majority of the people feel this way? They want the government to listen to their voice. Very simple. That's number one. Number two, the will of the people, the majority of citizens, must prevail. Now, the will of the people isn't perfect. We are not perfect. But the majority will of the people is sure a lot better than what we have now. What we have now is spending us into oblivion, creating many laws that we don't need, and ignoring laws that we do need. And so the will of the people, the citizens, must prevail. Number three, this nation is at a point of tension and high risk due to the carelessness of our elected officials, making it necessary for the people to make corrections. In other words, the government has forced us, the people, into action. We don't want to go into action. We just want to elect our representatives, sit back, and then enjoy the good life. But they're not letting us do that. They're interfering with our good life so much that we, the people, are forced to take action. Number four, elected officials will criticize our speaking out at their own peril. We, the majority, will vote them out if they hear us not. So this is a clarion call to the people that represent us. Hear us, or you will be voted out. 5, we believe in civility and encourage all debate to be a courteous exchange based on the issues rather than personal attacks. Now, there's been a lot of complaining about personal attacks and all kinds of media, written, radio, TV, everywhere. And no one is squeaky clean on this issue. But what we want, what the majority of the people want, is to be as civil as possible, yet we don't want to outlaw any free speech. We don't want to tell anyone they can't say anything that's politically incorrect. We want freedom to prevail, but we desire a little civility. Now, the next portion of these theses is divided into different sections, and the next section is on spending. Spending is a big thorn in the side. Number 6 deals with this. We, the people, have to budget our money wisely and live within our means. We absolutely demand that the government do the same thing. If we have to budget, then the government needs to budget too. That's self-evident, isn't it? It should be self-evident, but you know, there's hundreds of people in Congress that's just oblivious to this fact.